The projector clicked to life in the smoky darkness of the Reich Chancellery. Berlin, 1938. Grainy footage of American factories flickered across the wall. Endless assembly lines. Workers in coveralls, machines stamping steel with relentless precision. Adolf Hitler leaned forward, watching Henry Ford's industrial empire unfold before his calculating eyes. A laugh escaped his lips, sharp, dismissive. Assembly line armies, he sneered to his generals, gesturing at the screen with theatrical contempt. Look at this American circus. Mass production of inferior machines by inferior workers. The room filled with knowing chuckles from his staff, their faces illuminated by the dancing light of Detroit's foundries. Hitler rose from his seat, pacing before the projected images of Ford's River Rouge complex. Steam billowed from massive smokestacks, while thousands of workers moved through the sprawling facility like ants serving their mechanical queen. To the Führer, it represented everything he despised about American capitalism: quantity over quality, efficiency over craftsmanship. German engineering is built by masters, he declared, his voice rising with conviction. Each Panzer tank, each Messerschmitt fighter, hand-forged by artisans who understand perfection. These Americans build toys. Tin soldiers for tin generals. His generals nodded in calculated agreement. Wilhelm Keitel scratched notes in his leather portfolio. Hermann Göring adjusted his medals with satisfaction. None dared question the Führer's industrial prophecy. But in that moment of supreme arrogance, Adolf Hitler sealed his fate. He saw Ford's assembly lines and imagined weakness were the greatest strength in human. History was awakening. 3,000 miles away. The heart of industrial America began to stir. The Ford River Rouge complex stretched across 2,000 acres of Michigan earth like a sleeping titan. Smokestacks reached toward the gray December sky of 1941. Their shadows falling across railway yards filled with coal cars and steel ingots. Inside the sprawling maze of buildings, the machinery that had once churned out Model T Fords now hummed with different purpose. Pearl Harbor had changed everything. The attack that shattered America's isolationist dreams also awakened something Hitler had failed to comprehend in that Berlin screening room: the raw, unstoppable power of American industrial might. Henry Ford himself walked the factory floors with grim determination. The man who had revolutionized automobile production now faced his greatest challenge: transforming his empire of civilian vehicles into an arsenal of war. The assembly lines that had produced affordable cars for millions would now forge the instruments of Nazi Germany's destruction. The transformation began with fire and molten steel. Blast furnaces that had cooled during the Depression roared back to life, their flames visible through reinforced windows like glimpses into industrial hell. Workers who had built sedans and coupes now studied blueprints for aircraft engines, tank transmissions, and military trucks. The familiar rhythm of peacetime production gave way to the urgent tempo of a nation mobilizing for total war. At Ford's Willow Run plant, construction crews worked around the clock to build what would become the largest single-story factory in the world. The building stretched for over a mile, so vast that fog sometimes formed inside during humid Michigan summers. This cathedral of steel and concrete would soon birth bombers at a rate that would make Hitler's boasts about German craftsmanship seem like whispers in a hurricane. But the awakening wasn't just mechanical. It was human. Workers who had struggled through the Great Depression now found purpose in paychecks that carried the weight of democracy itself. Women traded aprons for welding torches. Teenagers left high school early to operate drill presses. Entire families devoted themselves to the machinery of liberation, understanding that every rivet, every bolt, every precisely machined part brought victory one step closer. By 1942, America's industrial heartland had transformed into something unprecedented in human history. The real battlefield of World War II didn't exist in the deserts of North Africa or the forests of Europe. It lived inside the roaring caverns of American factories, where victory was measured not in territory captured, but in tonnage produced at Ford's Willow Run plant. The impossible became routine. Every hour, a gleaming B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the assembly line. 4 engines, 10 machine guns, and enough aluminum to build 50 automobiles. All assembled with the same methodical precision Henry Ford had applied to civilian cars. Workers nicknamed the facility, "Will it run?" But there was nothing uncertain about its output. The plant operated 24 hours a day, its lights visible from miles away, like an industrial lighthouse guiding America toward victory. The statistics were staggering, but the human drama was even more compelling. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a propaganda poster. She was Mary Henderson from Detroit, working the night shift to support her husband stationed in the Pacific. She was Anna Kowalski from Hamtramck, whose Polish family had fled Europe's wars only to help America win this one. She was thousands of women whose calloused hands shaped the aluminum that would carry bombs to Berlin. The transformation reached beyond gender into the very soul of American society. The same assembly lines that had once symbolized industrial monotony now represented hope. Workers understood that their labor connected directly to soldiers fighting halfway around the world. Every Sherman tank rolling out of Detroit carried with it the dreams of families who had never seen combat but fought their own battle against fascism with overtime shifts and aching backs. At General Motors, the Cadillac division abandoned luxury automobiles to produce M5 light tanks. Chrysler's Dodge plant churned out truck engines designed to carry supplies across the deserts of North Africa. The big 3 automakers had become the industrial trinity of American military might, their production capacity dwarfing anything Germany could imagine. The factories operated with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. Raw materials entered one end of the complex: iron ore from Minnesota, rubber from plantations in Brazil, aluminum from smelters in the Pacific Northwest, and emerged as finished weapons of war. The logistics alone required a coordination that made Hitler's vaunted German organization look primitive by comparison. Workers developed an almost mystical connection to their craft. They could identify the sound of properly aligned machinery, detect flaws in metal alloys by touch, and maintain production schedules that pushed human endurance to its limits. The factory floor became a place where American democracy proved its strength, not through speeches or parades, but through the steady accumulation of industrial power that would ultimately bury the Third Reich under an avalanche of steel. While American factories hummed with mechanical precision, German industry clung to traditions that would prove fatal. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Ford's River Rouge produced trucks with interchangeable parts and standardized components, while German tank factories still relied on skilled craftsmen hand-fitting each piece like medieval armorers. Hitler's obsession with superior engineering had created a production nightmare. German panzer tanks were undeniably sophisticated, their thick armor and powerful guns representing the pinnacle of mechanical craftsmanship. But sophistication came at a price. Each Tiger tank required over 300,000 man-hours to complete, while Ford could build 6 Sherman tanks in the same time. German factories produced quality. American factories produced quantity on a scale that redefined warfare itself. The numbers told a story of industrial evolution versus industrial revolution. Germany's entire tank production for 1943 barely exceeded 12,000 vehicles. Ford alone produced over 500,000 military vehicles that same year. Trucks, jeeps, amphibious craft, and armored vehicles rolling off assembly lines with clockwork regularity. When German panzer crews encountered American armor, they weren't facing superior tanks. They were facing an inexhaustible tide of adequate ones. The philosophy extended beyond vehicles into every aspect of military production. German aircraft factories employed master craftsmen who could build beautiful, deadly fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109. But American plants at Willow Run could produce B-24 bombers faster than Germany could train pilots to fly interceptors. The mathematics of industrial warfare favored abundance over excellence, and America had learned to manufacture abundance like a natural resource dot in North Africa. The implications became brutally clear. Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps fought with typical German efficiency. Skilled soldiers using superior equipment with tactical brilliance that won battle after battle. But victories meant nothing when American supply ships arrived in Alexandria carrying endless replacements for every tank destroyed, every truck disabled, every aircraft shot down. Rommel's forces wore themselves out fighting an enemy that could afford to lose equipment faster than Germany could produce it. The Desert Fox himself recognized the futility. In letters to his wife, Rommel wrote of facing not just enemy soldiers, but an entire industrial system. His panzer crews reported American supply convoys stretching beyond the horizon. Thousands of trucks carrying fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and fresh equipment. German mechanics scavenged battlefields for salvageable components while American repair depots discarded damaged vehicles and issued brand new replacements. By 1943, the strategic balance had shifted permanently. Hitler's contempt for mass production had become Germany's death sentence. The assembly line mentality he had mocked in the Berlin screening room now produced the instruments of his defeat. Every day that passed saw American industrial capacity grow stronger while German factories struggled under bombing raids and resource shortages. The war of production had been decided before the first shot was fired. But Hitler's arrogance had blinded him to the verdict. June 6, 1944. Dawn broke gray and violent over the English Channel as the largest invasion fleet in human history approached the coast of Nazi-occupied France. But this wasn't just an army crossing the water. It was the entire American industrial complex made manifest in steel and flesh. Every rivet and bolt forged in the factories, Hitler had dismissed as inadequate. The landing craft grinding through the surf carried more than soldiers. They carried the concentrated output of Detroit's assembly lines. 4 built engines powering amphibious vehicles through the chaos of Omaha Beach. General Motors transmissions driving Sherman tanks up the Norman Bluffs. Chrysler manufactured trucks waiting to push supplies inland once the beachhead was secured. Every piece of American-made equipment bore the fingerprints of workers who had never seen combat, but whose labor now thundered across Hitler's Atlantic wall as the rams dropped and men charged into machine gun fire. The vehicles that carried them forward represented something unprecedented in military history. The same DUKW amphibious trucks that had rolled off assembly lines in Yellow Truck and Coach manufacturing company facilities now ferried ammunition through surf red with blood. Ford Jeeps, built with the same precision that had once produced civilian automobiles, raced across sand dunes, carrying wounded soldiers and urgent communications. From a German soldier's perspective, the invasion must have seemed supernatural. Wave after wave of identical vehicles emerged from the sea, not the handcrafted machines of German engineering, but mass-produced instruments of liberation that replaced themselves faster than they could be destroyed. Panzerfaust rockets that destroyed one American tank found 2 more advancing to take its place. Machine gun fire that disabled one truck was answered by another, arriving within minutes. The logistics alone demonstrated industrial warfare's true nature. American supply officers had calculated that each soldier required 41 pounds of equipment and supplies per day to maintain combat effectiveness. Multiply that by 150,000 men landing on D-Day, And the mathematics of liberation required over 3 million pounds of materiel flowing across the beaches every 24 hours. Only an industrial system geared for mass production could sustain such a demand. Behind the immediate drama of combat, a deeper transformation was occurring. German defenders weren't just fighting American soldiers, they were fighting American factories. Every bullet fired had been manufactured in facilities that could produce replacements faster than they could be expended. Every vehicle destroyed was backed by production lines that treated individual tanks and trucks as interchangeable components in a vast mechanical organism dedicated to Nazi Germany's destruction. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical one. German veterans who had fought in Russia and North Africa recognized superior equipment when they saw it. But Normandy presented something different: adequate equipment in overwhelming abundance. The Americans didn't need the best tanks in the world when they could field 10 good tanks for every excellent German panzer. Industrial democracy had found its perfect expression in the surf and sand of occupied France. And Hitler's master race was discovering that craftsmanship couldn't compete with capacity. 2 months after D-Day, a river of steel flowed across the French countryside. The Red Ball Express, a convoy system that stretched from the Normandy beaches to the advancing front lines, represented American industrial might in its purest form. Thousands of trucks, most bearing the Ford Oval or General Motors badges, formed an endless procession of liberation that German scouts reported with mixture of awe and despair. The convoy operated like a mechanical circulatory system, pumping the lifeblood of modern warfare: fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment through arteries of French roads that had never seen such industrial abundance. 6,000 trucks moved in continuous rotation, their Detroit-built engines running 24 hours a day, covering 700 miles of highway in an automotive ballet that would have made Henry Ford proud. Each truck carried 5 tons of supplies, but the cargo represented something larger than mere tonnage. These vehicles embodied the transformation of American society from peacetime consumer economy to wartime production machine. The same factories that had once competed to produce the most attractive automobile now collaborated to manufacture the most effective instruments of victory. Corporate rivalry had been subordinated to national purpose, and the result rolled across Europe in an unstoppable tide of internal combustion engines and determination. German intelligence officers struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights reported mechanical rivers flowing through the French countryside, convoys so long that pilots couldn't see their beginning or end from reconnaissance altitude. The reports seemed impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. America had industrialized warfare itself, turning logistics into a production process as efficient as any assembly line. The human drama unfolded in truck cabs and supply depots across liberated France. Drivers worked in shifts that pushed endurance to its limits, their vehicles climbing through gear ratios designed in Detroit engineering offices but tested on the hills of Normandy. Many drivers were Black Americans, members of transportation companies who had been denied combat roles but now found themselves on the front lines of a different kind of battle. The race to keep Allied armies supplied faster than German forces could retreat. The strategic implications rippled across the entire European theater. German commanders who had mastered the art of tactical withdrawal found themselves facing an enemy that moved at the speed of American industry. Panzer divisions that destroyed Allied equipment in successful defensive actions discovered that replacements arrived faster than the wreckage could be cleared from the battlefield. The Wehrmacht was fighting not just the American army, but the American economy, and the economy was winged. By September 1944, The Red Ball Express had moved over 400,000 tons of supplies to Allied forces advancing toward Germany. The statistics represented more than logistical achievement. They demonstrated the victory of industrial democracy over ideological dictatorship. Hitler had bet Germany's future on the superiority of craftsmanship and racial determination. America had answered with assembly lines and organizational efficiency, proving that free societies could mobilize their resources more effectively than totalitarian states. The trucks rolling across France carried more than military supplies. They carried the vindication of democratic capitalism and the death sentence of the thousand-year Reich. Winter descended on Germany like a mechanical shroud. By December 1944, Hitler's industrial gamble had reached its inevitable conclusion. German factories that had once produced the world's most sophisticated military equipment now struggled to maintain even basic production. Raw materials became scarce. Skilled workers had been conscripted into increasingly desperate military units. And Allied bombing had reduced once proud manufacturing centers to smoking ruins. The contrast with American production capacity had become grotesque. While Ford's Willow Run plant continued producing B-24 bombers at the rate of 1 per hour, German aircraft factories celebrated weekly production numbers that American plants achieved in single shifts. The mathematical certainty of industrial warfare was grinding the Third Reich into statistical irrelevance on the frozen battlefields of the Ardennes. During what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, the final accounting came due. German panzer crews launched Hitler's last major offensive with equipment that represented the accumulated output of factories operating under increasingly impossible conditions. Tanks broke down from mechanical failures that couldn't be repaired because replacement parts simply didn't exist. Vehicles ran out of fuel because German refineries had been bombed into uselessness. The Wehrmacht was fighting with the industrial corpse of a nation that had rejected mass production in favor of artisanal excellence. The Americans responded with characteristic industrial efficiency. Damaged Sherman tanks were either repaired immediately or replaced with new vehicles fresh from Detroit assembly lines. Supply convoys continued flowing despite winter weather that would have paralyzed less mechanized armies. When German panzers broke through Allied lines, they encountered not just military resistance, but the full weight of American industrial capacity made manifest in endless streams of replacement equipment. German soldiers, many of them veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, recognized what they were facing. This wasn't just another enemy army. This was an entire economic system that had transformed itself into a machine for producing victory. Captured American equipment revealed manufacturing standards that seemed almost careless in their abundance. Where German engineers designed vehicles to last for years of service, American factories built them to be replaced after months of use. The psychology was completely different and completely devastating. The industrial comparison had become a death sentence. Germany's entire military vehicle production for 1944 totaled fewer units than Ford alone produced in any given month. The numbers told the story of a nation that had chosen ideology over efficiency, craftsmanship over capacity, and was now paying the ultimate price for that decision. Hitler's mockery of American mass production had become a prophecy of German defeat. In Berlin, the Führer, who had once laughed at Ford's assembly lines, now raged at his generals about wonder weapons and secret projects that would somehow reverse the industrial mathematics of modern warfare. But mathematics doesn't yield to ideology. And the factories of Detroit continued their mechanical march toward victory while German industry collapsed under the weight of its own philosophical contradictions. The master race was being buried under a mountain of mass-produced steel, exactly as American industrialists had always known it would be. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. as celebrations erupted across the United States. The factories that had won the war began their next transformation. At Ford's River Rouge complex, workers who had spent 4 years producing engines of destruction now retooled their assembly lines for peace. The same mechanical precision that had defeated fascism would now rebuild a shattered world. The lesson was written in steel and etched in history. Hitler's contempt for American industrial capacity had proven to be one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in human history. The assembly lines he had mocked as inferior had produced 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and 2.5 million trucks, an industrial output that dwarfed the combined production of all Axis nations. Mass production hadn't created inferior weapons. It had created an inexhaustible arsenal that buried the Third Reich under sheer abundance. Henry Ford himself, now in his 80s, walked through his factories one final time as a wartime industrialist. The man who had revolutionized civilian transportation had spent the war years proving that democracy's greatest weapon wasn't superior soldiers or better strategy. It was the ability to organize free people in pursuit of common purpose. American workers had volunteered for overtime shifts, accepted rationing, and transformed their lives in service of victory, demonstrating that free societies could mobilize more effectively than totalitarian states. The broader implications extended far beyond military history. The war had proven that industrial capacity, not racial ideology or military tradition, determined the outcome of modern conflicts. Nations that could produce abundant, reliable equipment would defeat nations that produce small quantities of superior weapons. The mathematics of industrial warfare were unforgiving, and America had written those equations in the language of assembly lines and production quotas. As factory lights dimmed across the American Midwest, the workers who had won the war returned to civilian life with a quiet knowledge of their achievement. They had faced down the most aggressive military machine in human history, not with superior courage or better tactics, but with overtime shifts and production schedules. They had proven that democracy's greatest strength lay not in its ideals, but in its ability to organize ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. The documentary ends not with military parades or political speeches, but with a simple image: workers leaving their shifts at Ford's River Rouge complex, their faces lit by dawn sunlight rather than furnace fire. These were the people who had answered Hitler's mockery with the steady rhythm of assembly lines, who had transformed American industry into an instrument of liberation, and who had proven that in the modern world, victory belonged not to the master race, but to the master builders. The war had been fought by soldiers, but it was won by factory workers. And in that victory lay the blueprint for everything that would follow in the American century. Asterisk in the end. Hitler's laughter in that Berlin screening room became the echo of his own defeat. He had seen Ford's assembly lines and imagined weakness where the greatest strength in human history was awakening. The 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years. The industrial democracy that buried it has endured for generations. Its legacy written not in conquest, but in the quiet power of free people working together toward common purpose.